Hello, my name is Scott Cooper, and I was asked by the Urban Creeks Council to give you a brief introduction to the ecology of our local streams, particularly Mission Creek. I have been a professor of ecology at the University of California, Santa Barbara for 40 years. I retired about 8 years ago, but I still maintain an active research program. My area of expertise is stream ecology, and I've conducted research on streams throughout Southern California and the Sierra Nevada. Initially, a lot of my research projects focused on stream food webs. In other words, who eats whom and how do predators affect prey populations. But in the last 20 years, I switched my focus, and now I'm concentrated on the effects of wildfire, debris flows, and land use change, that is conversion from wildlands to agricultural and urban lands on streams. Now, a couple of my major research sites are Rattlesnake and Mission Creeks. And in that context, we've studied, for example, how both of these streams recovered from the Hesacita fire. And we're also comparing them to the streams in Montecito that were affected by debris flows. In addition to all this research, I've done a variety of teaching and outreach activities in these streams. I used to take my UCSB classes on field trips to Rattlesnake and Mission Creeks all the time. More recently, I've been involved in Botanic Gardens initiatives, such as participating in their BioBlitz, and also mentoring, leading field trips, supervising laboratory activities for their extreme team, which is a set of high school students that are learning about the habitats and management of the Botanic Gardens. So in my introduction today, I want to emphasize two messages. One is that everything and anything that occurs in a valley will affect its drainage stream. And secondly, that streams and the riparian vegetation, streamside vegetation along them, are hotspots of biodiversity with many species that interact in complex ways. So I'm going to switch now to the PowerPoint so I can go over all of these issues. So if you can bear with me just a minute. A principle of stream ecology is that the valley rules the stream. So anything that happens in a catchment or watershed or drainage basin, and those terms are all used interchangeably, will determine the physics and chemistry of the stream or creek. And that in turn will determine the kinds of organisms that occur there and how abundant they are. Now in natural streams, there are four major factors that determine the characteristics of streams. First is the topography of the basin. Where are the slopes, valleys, mountains that are drained by the stream? How steep are the slopes? And all of these topographic factors affect climate. For example, we get a lot of rain on this side of the mountains because the storms rise up over the mountains, they drop their moisture, and the other side is much drier. And we call that a rain shadow effect. In addition, topography determines the directions, speeds, and amounts of water that flows off the landscape into the stream. And associated with this is climate. So in our Mediterranean climates here, we have cool, wet winters and warm, dry summers. So the organisms that occur here have to deal with sometimes floods in the winter time, and the summer with diminished flows or drying. In addition, climate, of course, affects temperature, and that has a lot of impacts because different kinds of organisms have different temperature tolerances, and it affects humidity, which affects how prone our vegetation is to wildfires. The third issue is geology. As water percolates down through the soils, runs over the rocks and bedrock, it picks up all kinds of chemical substances or constituents. And those determine largely, they're carried into the stream, ultimately by the stream into the ocean, but these inputs determine the water chemistry. And again, different organisms react to those chemicals in different ways. It also determines water inputs, how much of the flow goes overland versus percolates down to groundwater and then emerges into streams. through springs. The fourth is vegetation, and vegetation is all important in our watersheds. Vegetation intercepts rainfall, so it prevents the impact of rain droplets directly on soils and underlying rocks, and so there's less erosion and less sediment inputs to streams. In addition, there is a lot of leaf litter that forms under this vegetation that acts as a sponge to soak up water from the rainfall. And that allows more of the water to percolate down through soil horizons to groundwater instead of just running off the surface of the land. Vegetation also affects water chemistry. A lot of substances are leached out of vegetation. And in addition, particularly for the vegetation along the stream, the riparian vegetation, they provide shadings. They lower temperatures, favoring those organisms that like cooler temperatures. There's also a lot of leaf litter input that comes from these trees that are a major food source in streams. So in looking at the food webs, this is Rattlesnake Creek. This is a pool, and it's connected to another pool by these waterfalls or riffles, these whitewater stones. Now, in streams with a lot of riparian canopy that are shaded, we get a lot of leaf litter inputs. We get white alder, California bay sycamore, and other tree species dropping their leaves. Those leaves, after they fall into streams, are attacked by bacteria and fungi, or what we call microbes. And these microbes use the leaves as their energy source, but also break them down. Now, this amalgam of leaf litter and microbes is eaten by a group of invertebrates we call shredders. And so this is a caddisfly. There's the head of the caddisfly. And this one builds a case or home out of bits of sticks or sometimes leaves and carries around with them. This is a cranefly larvae. But all of these not only use leaves and microbes as their energy source, but they break them up into finer particles that we call FPOM, which just means fine particulate organic matter. Now, some of that fine matter is carried downstream in the water column, and there it's intercepted by a variety of invertebrates that we call collectors. This is a blackfly larvae, and blackfly larvae have head fans. And these head fans are strung with saliva, and it's sticky. And so any particles are intercepted by these head fans, and the blackfly wipes them off from their mouth parts, and that's how they ingest food. This is a caddisfly, and this one spins a net, a sticky net. They live in a house they build at the back end of this net, and they come out periodically to harvest particles off the net. Now, some of this fine material also settles out on the bottom, and it's eaten by what we call deposit feeders, various worms. Here's a couple of mayflies, and here's a midge larvae. And I want to emphasize that except for the worms, all these other invertebrates are insects, and all of them have aquatic larval stages, but as adults, they're terrestrial and they fly around. The midge, for example, emerges into a form that looks a lot like a mosquito. So this is what we call the detritus-based part of the food web. Detritus is just suspended material with its microbes. The other part is where there's enough light, where canopies are more open, more light reaches the stream bottom, we get various kinds of algae. So these algae, which are called diatoms, have an outer covering made of glass or silicon dioxide. They often form this brown scuzz on the surfaces of rocks. And then this is a visible large green alga that called Cladophora, but it proliferates under high light nutrient conditions. Well, all these algae that coat the stream bottom are eaten by various invertebrates we call grazers. They include mayflies. This is a caddisfly that builds a case out of stones, and this is another caddisfly that builds a case out of stones, but it does so in the form of a snail. Snails are grazers. This is a water penny. It's a beetle larvae. This is a bottom or ventral view, but they crawl around on rocks, and they eat primarily diatoms. And finally, tadpoles are primarily grazers. They eat primarily algae. Now, all of these invertebrates, shredders, collectors, and grazers, are eaten by various predators, including invertebrate predators like the larvae of this damselfly, this dragonfly, this stonefly, and a variety of vertebrate predators like rainbow trout, which occur in more permanent streams locally. The sea-run form of the rainbow trout, of course, is called the steelhead. This is the larvae of the California newt, which are also top predators in our local streams. Now, food webs don't determine there because they have interactions with the terrestrial environment. So, for example, the two-striped garter snake eats primarily tadpoles, and I've seen them many times catching tadpoles in stream pools. And then there's also a variety of terrestrial predators like raccoons and others, birds and mammals, that will eat many of these invertebrates, fish, and so on that occur within our streams. In fact, raccoons will eat almost anything that they can capture. Now, to further emphasize interactions between the riparian zone and the streams, there's so many inputs that go from the riparian zone into the stream. Things like leaf litter that falls off and becomes a food source for invertebrates there. And then in addition, there's a lot of insects and spiders that fall into streams, and those are eaten by trout and insects like water striders. In turn, there's also bugs. Many of these stream invertebrates emerge as a terrestrial flying adult form, and these are eaten by a variety of terrestrial predators like frogs, bats, beetles, dragonflies, birds, spiders. And so there's a very rich community that's centered around all the insects emerging from the stream. Now, you have an idea then of everything that affects streams from the watershed and a bit of what stream food webs look like. So I want to turn just briefly to human impacts on streams. And there's about 5 major ways that human will affect streams. The big one is habitat destruction, degradation. Anytime you destroy or damage either upland or riparian vegetation, that has many implications for the stream itself. Various kinds of pollutants. The biggest pollutant in the US is sediment in terms of volumes. But there's many other contaminants that are thrown in that are toxic at high enough concentrations. I won't talk much about the rest of these, so I can do it in question and answer if you like, but we also have problems with invasive species, with climate change, and in some systems, but not so much here with overfishing. So the Urban Creeks Council asked me to emphasize the impacts of road construction or maintenance, and how does that affect our streams? And one is that this road construction destroys or damages upland and riparian vegetation. And this causes increased runoff, erosion, and sediment inputs to stream. And these sediment inputs can smother the stream bottom. And they can cover algae and prevent them from photosynthesizing, destroying that food source. They can cover leaf litter, and they prevent the penetration of oxygen into the sediment. And so all of these organisms require oxygen, so they're very negatively affected by the deposition of fine silts and clays in streams. Especially in the riparian vegetation, these activities can also, by destroying riparian vegetation, reduce shading. This increases temperatures, so often to levels where species like trout cannot occur. It lowers leaf inputs, but often results in algal blooms. Also, results associated with this sediment are nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, and they actually will also fuel algal blooms. And sometimes you get, at high enough concentrations, toxic materials like metals. For example, in the Central Valley, selenium is a big problem. The other is direct sediment inputs. When you actually bulldoze sediments into creeks, it actually fills in the creek with sediment so that there's less surface flow. Most of the flow goes underneath the rocks and boulders, whatever's been pushed into the stream. And with reduced surface flows, you have less organic material flowing downstream, so you lose many of the collectors. It blocks migrations of fish, and it fills in the pools. And in Southern California, pools are all important because these are the refuges during the dry season for many of the fish and invertebrates that occur there. And then finally, as I mentioned above, direct sediment inputs also clog or smother bottom substrate, result in many cases in low dissolved oxygen if a lot of that sediment is very fine. So I'm going to stop the slideshow and come back to myself, but I hope that this has given you an introduction to what our local streams look like, what occurs in them, how they're impacted, both by natural and human processes. And now I'll segue into the next videos that will talk more specifically about the damage to Mission Creek and its environs caused by SC&E road maintenance activities. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your participation in tonight's forum from the Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council.